Hello, hi, or in my native Lushootseed language, HF. My name is Aaliyah. Welcome to the Hebel Cultural Center, located here in Tulalip, Washington. This special museum houses our Tulalip tribe's heritage, values, and history. One of our culture's significant resources is the majestic cedar tree. My ancestors, Native Americans, also known as indigenous people, protected and utilized this strong yet lightweight wood to create their clothing, tools, transportation, shelter, and traditional art. The inner rings of the cedar measure the passage of time, and kind of like that saying, if these walls could talk, if these rings could talk, they'd have grueling stories to tell about changes and shocking trauma Native tribes faced. The last couple of years have also brought hard and unexpected circumstances to all of humanity in dealing with the COVID-19 virus. These rings, too, will long be remembered as tough and overwhelming. As transition through the pandemic continues, it reminds me about my ancestors becoming school students for the first time. While we, as students, recently waited for the ability to go back to school, 100 years ago, Tulalip students were trying to figure out how to literally survive school, when governments created boarding schools to house and educate Native Americans to the ways of settlers who colonized the area. Here along the shores of Tulalip Bay, one of these boarding schools was constructed, becoming home to harsh realities Native American students would face, and a time when going to school meant something very different than it does today. Stories from Indian boarding schools continue to unfold across America and Canada, highlighting the need and opportunity for acknowledgement, learning, and healing from this difficult period. Follow me back in time to learn how kids forced to attend the Tulalip boarding school faced an unexpected education. But first, a little background about how Indigenous people felt the rumble of change to their native ways of life. As colonization of North America continued west, governments created binding documents, known as treaties, to legally seize lands occupied by Native tribes. These treaties contained rules governing relationships and boundaries between white and indigenous people, and for most tribes, relocated and confined them to specific areas known as reservations. Treaties caused drastic change as tribes lost the vast majority of lands they had always lived on. Locally, Coast Salish tribes living in Puget Sound would be specifically affected by the Point Elliott Treaty. This treaty was signed on January 22, 1855, in Mukilteo, Washington, by 81 tribal leaders, including Snoqualmie Snohomish Chief Pat Kanan, Chief Seattle, and Washington's territorial governor, Isaac Stevens. Congress ratified this treaty into law in April 1859, and its impacts and disputes regarding promises and stipulations continue to this day. While there was great confusion in language and understanding of what the treaty really meant, tribal leaders realized the only way to preserve some resources and culture for their people was to go along with it. The treaty was to allow sovereignty for Indian people, meaning the ability to govern themselves. It was also to guarantee hunting, fishing, and gathering rights, and designate land for tribes to live on. Native Americans were supposed to get payments for land given away and receive medical care and education along with aid and tools in learning how to farm. Tribes had no knowledge of how to farm the land as their customs had been to move around with the cycle of nature's seasons and resources. As time went on, treaty intentions and the realities of what happened were far from what the tribal leaders could have imagined when they agreed to sign the Point Elliott Treaty. Early forms of tribal education from white people took place through the efforts of religious missionaries. In Tulalip, Father Eugene Charouse, a Catholic missionary originally from France, was sent to Christianize Puget Sound tribes. He lived on the Tulalip Reservation, educating and working with tribes from 1857 to 1878, until being reassigned to British Columbia. Father Sharus was generally accepted in Tulalip due to his mastery of many Salish tribe dialects and peacemaking style of communication. When money for education promised by the treaty did not come through, he did his best to raise funds, ultimately forming a school and church, the Mission of St. Anne, on the Tulalip Reservation. After Father Sharus's departure, Catholic nuns managed Tulalip schools until the U.S. government took over, building and opening the Tulalip Indian Boarding School with a focus on wiping out Indian culture. In January 1905, the Tulalip Indian Boarding School was opened, 50 years after the signing of Point Elliott Treaty, under the supervision of Dr. Charles Buchanan, the government-designated Indian agent, physician, and superintendent for the school. Indian children are forced to attend, live, and work at the school from 1st through 8th or 9th grades, returning home only for a couple of months in the summer. Like other Indian boarding schools being established across the U.S. and Canada, the Tulalip Indian Boarding School was organized like a military-style camp with strict rules and severe punishment for students who did not obey or were suspected as not following regulations. The schools were directed to ban the use of native languages to speed the process of assimilating Indians. Eventually, Native Americans would figure out how to understand white people once they learned English in the language of written words. However, it would cause the total loss of culture and native language for some tribes. At the Tulalip boarding school, gender-separated dormitories housed over 200 Indian boys and girls who were assigned numbered, heavy military-style uniforms for daily wear, regardless of the weather. A typical weekday school schedule began with bugle call at 5:30 a.m., followed by mandatory outdoor exercise at 6 a.m. As there was not enough government money to run Indian boarding schools, work shifts were assigned to Indian children by gender, age, and grade. Girls were required to prepare food, clean, handle laundry and sewing, and work in the school hospital. Boys were required to manage the dairy, stables, and farming, clean and maintain the school grounds and buildings. Between work shifts, required class attendance included reading, writing, math, and geography. Students also had to follow scheduled meal times, roll calls, marching, inspections, whistles, and bells by constantly hurrying and running until finally the 9 p.m. bugle played taps, signaling silence and lights out. Weekends meant double the number of chores on Saturdays since there were no classes. Sundays required a strict schedule of religious education, both Catholic and Protestant. Throughout their boarding school years, students faced constant fatigue, hunger, and poor food quality, at times finding worms in their breakfast of oatmeal or corn mush. Students suffered inadequate heat and living space and were subjected to abuse. The living conditions, coupled with the loss of family connection during the school year and a daily fear of punishment, led to student trauma, disease, and death throughout the school's tenure. Students caught disobeying rules or who tried to run away from the school faced severe punishments, like being isolated, shackled, whipped with riveted leather straps, had their heads shaved, were fed only bread and water, or were tied at the ankles and left to sleep on hallway floors all night. Some Indian boarding schools created cemeteries to handle the loss of students each year. Few surviving students have been able to talk about the experience. Harriet Shelton Dover was an exception, a Tulalip boarding school survivor, who lived to tell about it in her book, Tulalip from My Heart. Harriet lost her sister, along with relatives and friends, to tuberculosis, a common and deadly disease that swept through the boarding school. Of help to Harriet was occasionally seeing her dad, William Shelton, who worked at the Indian Agency and around the school campus. He was a comforting face for Indian children and worked to negotiate improvements for them. Shelton cautiously found ways to preserve Indian culture by becoming a trustworthy employee to Dr. Buchanan. After Harriet's 10 boarding school years, she went on to graduate from Everett High School in 1926. And 52 years later, in 1978, obtained an Associate of Arts degree from Everett Community College at age 74, hoping to inspire young tribal members to go to college. Harriet also learned from and continued in her father's footsteps, dedicating years of community service to her tribe. She helped bring back lost tribal ceremonies, recorded information, and preserved artifacts from her life and ancestry. In this video clip from Everett Community College, Harriet describes experiences from her Tulalip boarding school years.
I'm Cheryl Smith. I'm talking to Harriet Dover. Harriet, you were born and raised on the reservation, weren't you? The Tulalip Reservation?
Yes, I was. And that's a long time ago. Like the rest of us that are referred to as senior citizens, we've seen a lot of change. And I was one of those that went to the Tulalip Indian Boarding School. And when you say boarding school, I don't think anybody quite realized what it was that was happening to the Indian children. I used to think about it, but when I was going to the community college here, my professor of history, he referred to Indian reservations as concentration camps or penitentiaries. And it surprised me, you know, and I was saying how right you are. Sometimes I feel like talking about that. What I have here is a program for the year 1915 for that school. And if somebody ever had time to look at this everyday daily program, you'd wonder when did we ever have time to rest? Mm-hmm. I remember I was saying one time, all I did was run, run, run. You know, for 10 years. I arrived at that school in 1912 when I was 7. But I've been looking at this schedule, and it begins at 4:30 in the morning, and it goes till 9 o'clock. And that's when our day ended, 9 o'clock at night. And all of us, even the little 5-year-old children, all of us got up at 5:30 every morning. Mm-hmm. Whether it was, you know, Christmas, what we said was a holiday, or any Sunday, we all got up at 5:30. That doesn't you get used to it, and it isn't exactly that kind of a hardship. You do get into the routine. Mm-hmm. But there isn't a single moment in this whole day that we must have had to ourselves. No time to rest. It just went from roll call in the morning, or when you got up, bell would ring, everybody'd get up at 5:30. 5:30, and by 6 o'clock, all of us are outside, lined up with our coats on, and we take all the exercises that the soldiers take, you know, mm-hmm. Marines, everybody. We ran, we did all those physical exercises.
Even the 5-year-olds?
Even the little 5-year-olds. They certainly had to learn how to march, you know, left, right, companies from, the oldest children were in A company, the next was B, and smaller children were C and D. Company D, I was almost to the end of Company D when I arrived there. Those were the smallest children. But that was a time when the Department of the Interior of the United States, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they were just absolutely insane, with the power to civilize us. Mm-hmm. And so the pressure was really, really terrific. I was one of those that was punished for speaking our language in that boarding school. That was strictly against the regulation. Like everybody said, that's against the law for you to be speaking that language. And I was 9 years old, and one was my girlfriend. We were all about the same age, and one was my cousin. Here we were talking Indian. It just sounded good, We hadn't heard it for months. And somebody went and told on us because the matron came. We suddenly heard her voice. Where are they? And Upper fell to the floor. And so we knew there's no use running away. Just stay there. She came where we were down in the playroom. And each of us got a strapping. She said, now were you talking Indian? I said, yes, ma'am. Who was talking Indian? So I was. So, all right here. Well, anyway, we were strapped. Now that strap was really something. Years later, we found out that strap that kind was also used in penitentiaries, and it was really outlawed. But it was used on us, and what were we doing? We're 9 years old, and we're speaking our language. But I'll always remember that strapping. That really hurt. She hit us as hard as she could. And the only thing that saved my life is that we had our uniforms on, She strapped us from the back of the neck all the way to our ankles. Why, that burned. But, the hurt of it, the physical hurt was not as bad as how I felt in my own mind.
You wore uniforms then when
Yes,
you were in school?
Those were really something. On Sundays, we, Saturdays was always inspection. And we wore those uniforms, and ours were navy blue serge. Mm-hmm. And if you've ever, way back then, that navy blue serge was wool, and stiff and scratchy. That was a killer, like if the sun was shining and we were lined up outside. And we were lined up there for maybe an hour, out in the sun, mm-hmm. while we wait for the employees, and they walk up and down the line and look at us, how your hair and everything is. But being strapped, I never got over that for a long, long time. In fact, I'm not over it.
The Tulalip Indian Boarding School closed in 1932 as the shift to public school systems began. Today, information about Indian boarding schools continues to reveal generational impacts felt by families of student victims and those students who somehow survived physical, mental, and sexual abuse, malnourishment, child labor, medical care neglect, and loss of family foundation. Currently, our people continue hard legislative work to bring acknowledgement to this era because of long-lasting damage caused to families still trying to cope and recover. In Canada, September 30th has been established as a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, an annual day of remembrance also known as Orange Shirt Day. Here in Tulalip, we have also adopted this day to wear the color orange, come together, and honor Indian boarding school students. Thank you for taking this learning journey with me. While history sometimes reveals things that are hard to talk about, it is important in expanding awareness and understanding. As we go through our own ups and downs, stories from the past remind us about human resilience, the will to survive, having hope, and the importance of taking time to reconcile, repair, and restore. Hearing about the history of many cultures helps connect us as people, hopefully improving our ability to respect each other and the world we've been given as we live and learn along the way.